You. Here's our on straight. Are we live? It seems to say that we are. Oh, right. Hello. Welcome to Tuesday Tales of Terror, episode 21, as a matter of fact, where we read part 3 of Clive Barker's The Thief of Always. Can I make this bigger? No, that's the biggest that it'll go. Alright, we're just gonna dive in. Skinner. Oh, wonderful. Right. And we're still going through Harvey's first day, and every day is a full year, I guess. And so we just finished Halloween. And this is chapter 7, A Present from the Past. And it's this creepy tree that actually has a smiley face in the center of it. Da, 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 da. Yes? I'm gonna drink our homemade boba tea. With our paper straw. Ready? Let's begin. There was a Thanksgiving feast awaiting them when they got back into the house. "Oh, you look as though you've been in the wars," Mrs. Griffin remarked when she set eyes on Harvey. "Has Wendell been up to his tricks?" Harvey admitted that he'd fallen for all of them, but there was one that impressed him in particular. "What was that?" said Wendell with a smug grin. "The falling ladder? That was a clever little touch, wasn't it?" "No, not the ladder," said Harvey. "What then?" "The thing in the sky." "Oh, that. What was it? A kite?" "That wasn't my doing," Wendell replied. "What was it then?" "I don't know," Wendell said, his smile disappearing. "Better not to ask, eh?" "But I want to know," Harvey insisted, turning to Mrs. Griffin. "It had wings, and I think it flew off the roof." "Then it was a bat," Mrs. Griffin said. "No, this was 100 times bigger than a bat. He spread his arms. Great, dark wings." Mrs. Griffin frowned as Harvey spoke. "You imagined it," she said. "I did not," Harvey protested. "Why don't you just sit down and eat, dearie?" Mrs. Griffin replied. "If it wasn't a bat, then it wasn't anything at all." "But Wendell saw it too, didn't you, Wendell?" He looked around at the other boy, who was digging into a steaming plate of turkey and cranberry sauce. "Who cares?" Wendell said, chewing as he spoke. "Just tell her you saw it." Wendell shrugged. Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. It's Halloween night. There's supposed to be bogeymen out there." "But not real ones," said Harvey. "A trick's one thing, but if that beast was real—" As he spoke, he realized he was breaking the rule he'd made on the porch. Whether the winged creature was real or not didn't matter. This was a place of illusions. Wouldn't he be happier here if he just stopped questioning what was real and what wasn't? "Sit down and eat," Mrs. Griffin said again. Harvey shook his head. His appetite had disappeared. He was angry, though he wasn't quite sure at whom. Same. Maybe at Wendell for his shrugs, or at Mrs. Griffin for not believing him, or at himself for being afraid of illusions. Maybe all three. "I'm going up to my room to change," he said, and left the kitchen. He discovered Lulu on the landing, staring out the window. Wind gusted against the glass, reminding Harvey of Rictus's first visit. It wasn't rain the gusts were bringing, however. It was powdery snow. "It'll be Christmas soon," she said. Will it? There'll be presents for everyone. There always are. You should wish for something. Is that what you're doing? She shook her head. No, she said. I've been here so long, I've got everything I ever wanted. Would you like to see? Harvey said yes, and she led him up the stairs to her room, which was immense and filled with her treasures. She obviously had a passion for boxes. Tiny, jeweled boxes, large, carved boxes, a box for her collection of glass balls, a box that played tinkling music, a box into which 100 smaller boxes fit. She also had several families of dolls who sat in blank-faced rows around the walls, but more impressive by far was the house from which the dolls had been exiled. It stood in the middle of the room, 5 feet high from step to chimney top, every detail of brick, slate, and sill perfect. This is where I keep my friends, Lulu said, and opened the front door. 2 bright green lizards came out to greet her, scurrying up her arms onto her shoulders. The rest are inside, she said. Take a look. Harvey peered through the windows and found that every perfect room in the house was occupied. There were lizards lounging on the beds, lizards snoozing in the baths, lizards swinging from the chandeliers. He laughed out loud at their antics. Aren't they fun? Lulu said. Great, he replied. You can come up and play with them any time you want. Thanks. They're really very friendly. They only bite when they're hungry. Here. She plucked one off her shoulder and dropped it into Harvey's hands. It promptly ran up and perched on his head, much to Lulu's amusement. They enjoyed the company of both the lizards and each other for a long while, until Harvey caught a glimpse of his reflection in one of the windows and remembered what a sight he was. I'd better go and wash, he told Lulu. I'll see you later. She smiled at him. I like you, Harvey Swick, she said. Her honesty made him honest. I like you too, he told her. Then, his expression darkening, he said, I wouldn't want anything to happen to you. She looked puzzled. I saw you at the lake, he said. Did you? She replied. I don't remember. Well, anyway, it's deep. You should be careful. You could slip and fall in. I'll be careful, she said as he opened the door. Oh, and Harvey? Yes? Don't forget to wish for something. What shall I ask for? He wondered as he washed the dirt off his face. Something impossible, maybe, to see just how magic the house possessed. How much magic the house possessed. A white tiger, perhaps? A full-sized zeppelin? A ticket to the moon? The answer came from the depths of his memory. He'd wished for a present he'd been given and lost a long time ago, a present that his father had made for him, which Mr. Hood, however, much he wanted to please his new guest, would never be able to duplicate. The Ark, he murmured. With his face washed and the scratches he'd got from the thorns in the thicket worn like war wounds, he headed back downstairs to find that once again the house had performed an extraordinary transformation. A Christmas tree, so tall that the star at its summit pricked the ceiling, stood in the hallway, the colors of its twinkling lights seeping into every room. There was a smell of chocolate in the air, and the sound of carols being sung. Christmas. In the living room, Mrs. Griffin was sitting behind a roaring fire, sitting beside a roaring fire, with Stew Cat purring on her lap. Let's drink some liquids. Wendell's gone outside, she told Harvey. There's a scarf and gloves for you, boy, by the front door. Harvey went out onto the porch. The wind was icy, but it was already clearing the snow clouds, leaving the stars to shine down on a perfect white carpet. Snow. Not quite perfect. A trail of tracks led down from the house to the spot where Wendell was building a snowman. Coming out? He hollered to Harvey, his voice as clear as the bells that were ringing through the crisp air. Harvey shook his head. He was so tired, even the snow looked comfortable. "Maybe tomorrow," he said. "It'll be back tomorrow, won't it?" "Of course," yelled Wendell. "And the night after, and the night after." Harvey went back inside to look at the Christmas tree. Its branches were hung with strings of popcorn and cranberries, with colored lights and baubles and soldiers in gleaming silver uniforms. "There's something under there for you," Mrs. Griffin said, standing at the living room door. "I hope it's what you want, sweetie." Harvey knelt down and pulled a parcel with his name on it from under the tree. His pulse quickened before he even opened it, because he knew from its shape and from the way it rattled that his wish had been answered. He pulled at the string, remembering as he did so how much littler his hands had been the first time he held this gift. The paper tore and fell away, and there, shiny and new, was a painted wooden ark. It was a perfect copy of the one his father had made. The same yellow hull, the same orange prow, the same wheelhouse with holes in its red roof for the giraffes to put their heads through. The same lead animals, all in pairs, snug in the hold or peering through the portholes. 2 dogs, 2 elephants, 2 camels, 2 doves, all these and a dozen more. And finally, the same little Noah with his square white beard and his fat wife, complete with apron. "How did he know?" Harvey murmured. He hadn't intended the question to be heard, much less answered, but Mrs. Griffin said, "Mr. Hood knows every dream in your head." "But this is perfect," Harvey said in amazement. "Look, my dad ran out of blue paint when he was finishing the elephants, so one of them has blue eyes and the other one has green eyes. It's the same. It's exactly the same." "Does it please you, then?" Mrs. Griffin asked. "Oh, get out." Harvey said it did, but that wasn't entirely the truth. It was eerie to have the ark back in his hands when he knew the real one had been lost, as though time had been turned on its heels, and he was a little kid again. He heard Wendell stamping the snow off his feet at the front door, and was suddenly embarrassed to have such a childish present in his hands. He gathered it up in its wrappings and hurried away upstairs, intending to head back down for some supper, but his bed looked too welcoming to be refused, and his stomach quite full enough for one night, so instead he closed the curtains on the gusty night and laid his head down on the pillow. The Christmas bells were still ringing in some distant steeple, and their repetition lulled him into sleep. He dreamed that he was standing on the steps of his house, looking through the open door into its warm heart. Then the wind caught hold of him, turning him from the threshold and carrying him away into a dreamless sleep. Oh, okay. Now we have this picture. So this says Chapter 8, Hungry Waters. And we have this picture of these fish, and that must be the ark, and the little creatures all floating down. I don't know. It doesn't look like it's focusing, but you can see it. You can see it. Okay, moving on. That first day in the holiday house, with all its seasons and spectacles, set the pattern for the many that were to follow. When Harvey woke the following morning, the sun was once again pouring through a crack in the curtains, but this time it lay in a warm pool on the pillow beside him. He sat up with a shout and a smile. "Ha ha!" And either one or the other, and sometimes both, remained on his lips for the rest of the day. There was plenty to do. Work on the treehouse in the spring morning, followed by food and the laying of plans for the afternoon. Games and lazy hours in the heat of summer, sometimes with Wendell, sometimes with Lulu. Then adventures by the light of a harvest moon. And finally, when the winter wind had blown out the flames and the pumpkin heads and carpeted the grounds with snow, chilly fun for them and all out in the frosty air. and a warm Christmas welcome when they were done. It was a day of holidays, the third as fine as the second, and the fourth as fine as the third, and very soon Harvey began to forget that there was a dull world out beyond the wall where the great beast February was still sleeping its tedious sleep. His only real reminder of the life he'd left, besides a second telephone call he'd made to his mom and dad just to tell them all was well, was the present he'd wished for and received that first Christmas, his ark. He'd thought several times of trying it out on the lake to see if it would float, but it wasn't until the afternoon of the 7th day that he got around to doing so. Wendell had made a real glutton of himself at lunch and had declared that it was far too hot to play, so Harvey wandered down to the lake on his own with the ark tucked under his arm. He half expected, hoped in fact, to find Lulu down there to keep him company, but the banks of the lake were empty. Once he laid eyes on the gloomy waters, he almost gave up on the idea of a launching, but that meant admitting something to himself that he didn't wish to admit, so he headed on down to the shore, found a rock to perch on that looked less precarious than the others, and set his ark on the water. It floated well, he was pleased to see. He pushed it to and fro for a little while, then lifted it out and peered inside to see if it was leaking. It was quite watertight, however, so he set it back on the lake and pushed it out again. As he did so, he caught sight of a fish rising from the bottom of the lake, its mouth wide open as if it intended to swallow his little vessel whole. He reached out to snatch the ark from the water before it was either sunk or devoured, but in his haste he lost his footing on the slime-slickened rock, and with a cry, "Oh!" he fell into the lake. The water was icy cold and eager. It quickly closed over his head. He flailed wildly, trying not to imagine the dark depths beneath him, or the vast maw of the fish that had been rising from those depths. Turning his face up toward the surface, he started to swim. He could see his ark floating above him, capsized by his fall. Tragedy. Its lead passengers were already sinking. He didn't try and save them, but surfaced, gasping for breath, and paddled toward the shore. It wasn't much of a distance. In less than a minute, he was hauling himself up onto the rocks and scrambling away from the bank, water pouring from his sleeves and trousers and shoes. Only when his feet were clear of the lake and no hungry fish could snap at his toes did he drop onto the ground. Though it was midsummer and the sun was blazing somewhere overhead, the air around the lake was cold, and he soon began to shiver. Before he made his way out into the sun, however, he looked for some sign of his ark. The spot where it had sunk was marked by a forlorn flotilla of wreckage, all of which would soon join the rest of the ark at the bottom. Of the fish that had seemed so eager to devour him, there was no sign. Perhaps it had swum down into the depths to chew on the drowned menagerie. If so, Harvey hoped it choked on its dinner. He'd lost plenty of toys before. He'd had a brand new bicycle, his prize possession, stolen from the step of his house 2 birthdays ago. But this loss upset him as much, more in fact. The idea that the lake now had something that he'd owned was somehow worse than a thief running off with his bike. A thief was warm, flesh and blood. The lake was not. His possessions had gone into a nightmare place, full of monstrous things, and he felt as though a little part of himself had gone with it, down into the dark. He walked away from the lake without looking back, but the breeze that came to warm his face when he broke through the thicket and the sound of birds that pleased his ear could not keep from his mind the thought he'd tried to ignore when he'd gone down to the water. Despite all entertainments that the holiday house supplied so eagerly, it was a haunted place, and however hard he had tried to ignore his doubts and suppress his questions, they could be ignored and suppressed no longer. Whoever or whatever that haunter was, Harvey could not be content now until he'd seen in its face and knew its nature. Perfect. Chapter 9. What do you dream? Oh, and there's this interesting harpy-looking person, or gargoyle, or a living being. We'll find out. I bet it's that bat creature that we saw flying. Harvey didn't mention what had happened at the lake to anyone, not even Lulu, in part because he felt stupid for falling in, and in part because the house tried so hard to please him in the days that followed that he almost forgot about the accident entirely. That very night, in fact, he found a piece of colored string with his name tag on it at the base of the Christmas tree and followed it through the house to find a new bike, even more splendid than the one he'd lost 2 years before, waiting for him. But that was just the first of many fine surprises the holiday house sprang in quick succession. One morning, for instance, Wendell and Harvey climbed up into the treehouse to discover that the branches around it were swarming with parrots and monkeys. Fun. Another day, in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner, Mrs. Griffin called them through into the living room, where the flames of the fire had taken on the shapes of dragons and heroes, and were doing fiery battle in the grate. And in the heat of one lazy afternoon, Harvey was wakened from a doze by a chorus of shouts and found a troupe of mechanical acrobats performing clockwork-defying feats on the lawn. The greatest surprise, however, began with the appearance of one of Rictus's siblings. "My name is Jive," he said, stepping out of the early evening murk at the top of the stairs. Every muscle in his body seemed to be in motion. Ticks, jigs, and jitterings that had wasted him away until he barely cast a shadow. Even his hair, which was a mass of oiled curls, seemed to hear some crazed rhythm. It writhed on his scalp in a knotted frenzy. "Oh, okay. Brother Rictus sent me along to see how you're doing," he said, his tones succulent. Oh, tones succulent. What does he sound like? "I'm doing fine," Harvey replied. "Did you say Brother Rictus?" "We're from the same brood, loosely speaking," Jive said. "I hope you call your folks now and then." "Yep," said Harvey. "I called them yesterday." "Are they missing you?" "Didn't sound like it." "Are you missing them?" Harvey shrugged. "Not really," he said. This wasn't strictly true. He had his homesick days, but he knew if he went back home he'd be in school the day after, and wishing he'd stay at the holiday house a while longer. "You're going to make the most of being here, then?" said Jive. I don't know what he sounds like. I'm trying my best. Practicing a weird little dance step up and down the stairs. "Yeah," said Harvey. "I just want to have fun." "Who doesn't?" Jive grinned. "Who doesn't?" He sidled up to Harvey and whispered, "Speaking of fun." "What?" said Harvey. "You never did get Wendell back for that trick of his." There we go. "No, I didn't," said Harvey. "Well, why the heck not?" "I could never think of a way." "Oh, I'm sure we could cook something up between the two of us," Jive replied mischievously. "It has to be something you'll never think of," Harvey said. "That shouldn't be difficult," said Jive. "Tell me, what's your favorite monster?" Harvey didn't have to think hard about that. "A vampire," he said with a grin. "I found this great mask." "Masks are a good beginning," Jive said, "but vampires need to swoop out of the mist." He spread his arms, curling his long fingers like the claws of some eye-gouging beast. "Swoop down, snatch up their prey, then rise up again, up against the moon. I can see it now." "So can I," said Harvey, "but I'm not a bat." So how do I swoop?" "Ah," said Jive, "we'll have Ma work on that for us. After all, what's a Halloween without a transformation or two?" I'm jiving because he's jiving. He consulted the grandfather clock on the landing. "Hey, yo, grandfather clock." He didn't say that. I came up with that. "We've still got time to do it tonight. You go down and tell Wendell you'll meet him outside. I'll go up onto the roof and find Ma. You meet us up there." "I've never been up on the roof." "There's a door on the top landing. I'll see you up there in a few minutes." "I'll have to get my mask on and my coat and stuff. You won't need a mask tonight, Jive said. Trust me. Now you hurry up. Time's so wasting. It took Harvey only a minute or two to tell Wendell to go on ahead. He was sure Wendell suspected something and was probably preparing some counterattack, but Harvey knew he and Jive had something up their sleeves. Even Wendell, expert on shock tactics though he was, couldn't anticipate. With the first part of the plan laid, he hurried upstairs again, found the door Jive had mentioned, and climbed up onto the roof. Heights had never bothered him. He liked to be up above the world, looking down on it. Over here, Jive called to him, and Harvey took off along the narrow walkways and up the steep roofs to where his fellow conspirators stood. Sure-footed, Jive observed. No problem. How about flying? Said a third voice, as its owner stepped from the shadows of a chimney. This is Ma, Jive said. Another of our little family. Unlike Jive, who looked nimble enough to walk on the eaves of the whim took him, Mar seemed to have slug blood in her somewhere. Harvey almost expected to see her fingers leave silver trails on the brick she touched, or see soft horns appear from her balding head. She was grossly fat, her flesh barely clinging to her bones. Wherever it could, around her mouth and eyes, at her neck and wrists, it collapsed in clammy folds. She reached out and poked Harvey. I said, what about flying? What about it? Harvey said, pushing her hand away. Done much? I flew to Florida once. She doesn't mean in a plane, Jive told him. Oh, in dreams, maybe, said Mar. Oh, yeah, I dream about flying. That's good, Mar replied, grinning with satisfaction. She had not a single tooth in her mouth. Oh, God, her voice definitely sounds different. Harvey stared at the empty maw in disgust. You're wondering where they've gone, aren't you? She said to Harvey. Go on, admit it. Harvey shrugged. Well, yes, I am. Karna took him, the thieving brute. I had fine teeth, beautiful teeth. Who's Karna? Harvey wanted to know. Never mind, Jive said, hushing Mar before she could reply. Get to it. Oh, get to it, or he'll miss the moment. Mar muttered something beneath her breath and said, Come to me, boy, extending her arms in Harvey's direction. Her touch was icy. Feels weird, huh? Said Jive as Mar's fingers floated over his face, brushing it here and there. Don't worry. She knows what she's doing. And what's that? Changing you. Into what? You tell her, Jive said. It won't last long, so enjoy it. Go on, tell her about being a vampire. That's what I want Wendell to see, Harvey said. A vampire, Mar said softly, her fingers pressing harder against his skin. Yeah, I want to have fangs like a wolf, and red throat, and white skin, and I've been dead for 1,000 years. 2,000, said Jive. 10,000, said Harvey, beginning to enjoy the game, and crazy eyes that can see in the dark, and pointy ears like a bat's ears. Wait up, Mar said. I've got to get all this right. Her fingers were working hard upon him now, as though his flesh was clay, and she was molding it. His face was tingling, and he wanted to reach up and touch it, but he was afraid of spoiling her handiwork. And there's got to be fur, Jive observed. Sleek, black fur on his neck. Mara's hands dabbled at his throat. He felt fur sprouting where she touched him. And wings, Harvey said. Don't forget the wings. Never, said Jive. Spread your arms, boy, Marv told him. He did so, and she ran her hands along them, smiling now. It's It's good, she said. It's good. He looked down at himself. To his astonishment, he found his fingers were gnarled and sharp, and leathery flaps were hanging from his arms. The wind gusted against them, threatening to carry him off the roof then and there. You know you're playing a dangerous game, don't you? Mar said as she stood back to admire her handiwork. You'll either break your head, or you'll scare the life out of your friend Wendell, or both. He will fall, woman, Jive said. He's got the knack of this. I can tell just by looking at him. He peered at Harvey with his squinty eyes. Wouldn't be surprised if you weren't a vampire in another life, boy, he said. Vampires don't have other lives, Harvey said. The words were more difficult to say with a mouthful of fangs. They live forever. That's right, said Jive, snapping his fingers. So they do. So they do. Yeah. Well, I'm finished, Ma said. You can get going now, boy. The wind came gusting again, and if Jive hadn't been holding on to him as they walked to the edge of the roof, Harvey would surely have been carried away. There's your friend, Jive whispered, pointing down into the shadows. Before we go any further, look at this beautiful picture of Harvey being turned into a vampire. Yes. Much to his amazement, Harvey found that he could see Wendell quite clearly, even though it was pitch dark in the thicket. He could hear him, too, every little breath, every beat of his heart. Well, this is it, Jive hissed, putting his hand on Harvey's back. What do I do? Harvey said. Do I flap, or what? Jump, Jive said. The wind will take care of the rest. Enjoy the wind or gravity. And with that, he shoved Harvey off the edge of the roof and into the empty air. And that concludes Chapter 9 and our reading for this evening, Part 3. And we will pick up at Chapter 10 next week on our Tuesday Tales of Terror. No empty promises. We will have it, and it'll be great. I'm not going to say anything that I'm not going to do, but like a Zoom meeting. Anyway, I love you all. I hope that you're having a beautiful holiday season, and I will see you soon. If not, a presto. See you soon in my heart. Stay spooky.